Welcome to The Coach is In, the podcast for parent leaders who are juggling work, family, and life, and wondering if there's actually a way to do it all without falling apart. I'm Irene, a leadership coach on a mission to bridge generational gaps and bring fresh perspectives to the challenges parent leaders face.
And I'm Cat, a coach, lawyer, and mom who's been there, navigating the tightrope of leadership at home and work and figuring out what's actually worth the energy. If you're skeptical that balance, calm, or boundaries are even possible, we get it. We're not here for quick fixes or empty advice. We're here to have honest conversations. We'll share practical tools and maybe even help you see things differently. Because the coach is in, and this space is for you. Irene, I'm so happy to be here with you and chatting and reconnecting. I feel like all of our conversations end up making me feel calmer and a little smarter. So hopefully we're leaving the listeners with some semblance of that as well.
Likewise, I always appreciate this space and bringing some positivity into the conversations on my day-to-day, but also like now that we're sharing this with a larger audience, I hope that they share this experience with us.
Yeah. So what's coming up for you today as something that, over the past couple of weeks has surfaced as meaningful and, something you want to dig into?
I was actually reflecting on a previous episode that we touched on, which is like your episode on turning everyday news into life lessons. Touched on a lot of like the world leaders of today. And so I think for today, I wanted to talk about role models, perhaps how we identify who our role models are and how that affects us.
It's fun, as you're talking about role models, I would love to dive into kind of how you think you've identified role models and if that's, if who is your role model has evolved over time, et cetera. But I think as a mom, this conversation is so timely, especially with teens or tweens, because it's interesting to see who sparks their imagination and who my daughters and their friends talk about and who, as even if they won't call them role models, you can tell that they have an influence on how they think and their maybe what music they listen to or the clothes they dress, and it becomes something consciously or not that they aspire towards. So yeah, it's definitely a topic that I'm excited to discuss.
Yes, I love that you mentioned that point because I actually go back to the times when I was like a younger version of myself at the critical developmental stages. And I know you have daughters who are, teenagers. And I go back to that time and I feel like, oh, my role models are definitely people who have a lot of influence over me, but these are not role models that I consciously choose. It's just that, if I come across them, then I would naturally be drawn to them. It's not even like I have a choice in it, right? And so I grew up in a very small town, so small that Google Maps wouldn't even show the street names. And the population is so small, so we lived by the sea. We could see the stars every night. That's how rural it was, right? So how does a girl like that end up moving to the United States in New York, right? It's a huge shift. And for me, I was fortunate enough to have someone in my corner who encouraged me to really read books because for a small town girl like me, what is my exposure, right? Like it's very limited. But with books, it really expanded my worldview, even if it's not. So what I like reading biographies. I liked reading. There were fiction, like I loved Perry Mason by Earl Stanley Gardner. At one point, I wanted to be a lawyer because of how I just really loved reading those series. And so, yeah, those were what shaped my worldview. And I think I want to call out a few of the biographies that I read, which is number one is Sirin Phathanothai. I read about her when I was a teenager, maybe 14, I forget. But it left such an imprint in me because I read a couple of biographies of strong Asian female actual people that influenced my personality, I think. Sirin Phathanothai was diplomat from She was a daughter of a Thai politician who was sent to China at the time when they're not supposed to be legal channels between the countries.
Mm.
And she moved to China at a very tender age, maybe 5 or 6. And so, I mean, if you follow that story, or if you're inclined to read her biography, I would encourage young women to do so. She's still alive, by the way. I saw her at an interview from December of last year. So she's
Wow.
still very much in the picture. I kind of want to get back into, what she's up to. But yeah, that's what I wanted to share.
Oh, wow. We should dig up the book and leave it in the show notes because I feel like that I have not heard of this person and I would love to dig into it and read more. Um, I I read a fair number of, I mean, not as many biographies when I was in my teens, but the ones I can recall reading were actually, I was really into dance and I was a ballet dancer until I was about 16. And then I started branching out into other types of dance and like took dance classes, flamenco and African dance and, in college. But I remember really enjoying kind of these firsthand experiences of different principal ballerinas, et cetera, and learning from that the discipline that it takes to accomplish your big goal. So even though I never went on to become a ballet dancer and I stopped studying ballet at a certain point in time, that I think was my takeaway was kind of just, wow, like in order to accomplish certain ends, there's a degree of persistence and dedication that you have to have. And I would imagine that's also like similarly in reading the biographies that you read, you were taking away these lessons that led you to break the mold and do something that no one you do had ever done and come to the States and live in New York. That's pretty impactful.
Yeah, it's interesting that you have a very different interest than mine, but I want to call out that both of these interests may look very different, but they are very true to who we are. And so I guess coming
Mm,
from Asia, I had a Singaporean neighbor who critiqued that why is it that whenever we consume Asian content or Southeast Asian content, it always has to center around our struggles. Why can't it
mm,
just be our joys, right? And perhaps this is the contrast, like me coming from Southeast Asia and you growing up in
mm,
the United States, like we just
mm,
have very different perspectives, but both are very equally valid. Because I am
mm,
just now also getting to this point where I'm like, yeah, why can't I just do things for the joy of it? Like I can
mm.
dance.
Mm. This is a hot button topic for me, but the idea of the role of struggle in the role of how much we think we deserve something. Like I remember thinking like my stories, how much do they really matter if I haven't had a horrible life? Like I know it seems like it's not something that plagues me. I don't stay up at night thinking about this, but I remember when I was making art more frequently or when you know, had to write memoir experiences for creative writing classes and thinking about like yeah, I maybe I just am someone that tends to also downplay my struggles on some level, but I remember thinking like, well, I haven't been homeless, I haven't been physically abused, like what do I talk about? Because the idea that struggles defined the story was kind of something that I picked up somewhere and had a hard time letting go of or kind of working through. Yeah, I still at moments have questions about that, and but I'm interested to explore and maybe unpack with you and brainstorm, like maybe how does that fit into our definition of role models and who people might pick as a role model. Because maybe there's something about, oh, if this person overcame these struggles and these odds and accomplished something admirable that we find inspiring, does that compel us to feel like, oh, I maybe have fewer struggles, so I can also do this, or even if you have the same struggles, you can feel like they did it, so I can do it too. Does that ever come up for you? And do you
Yeah.
have those kind of brainstorm moments as well?
Yeah, and I actually love that the way that you're bringing this up because I feel like no one is devoid of struggles, right? Let's just put it out
Mm-hmm.
there. Like whether you have a good life, whether you're rich or you're poor or you're popular or you're a nobody, we all have struggles. And I find myself drawn to leaders who have had struggles but remained kind and fair and just has a really high integrity. I think I might call out Warren Buffett when I read his biography, The Snowball by Alice Schroeder. I was like, wow, this is someone that I can really look up to because I think leading up to that point, before I read his biography, before I turned 20, all I see are people who were making money left and right, but I didn't quite align with their values. So the dangerous message that I was receiving there is that, hey, rich people are kind of jerks. And I don't think
Mm-hmm.
that's the kind of lesson that that I needed to learn because making money is good, right? Like being really good at making money is good. So when I came across Warren Buffett, it really, I mean, and I'm glad that I did because we need to see or hear more leaders about him. Oftentimes, the leaders that we hear about in media are intense, they're very effective, but they don't necessarily align with my values. And so Warren Buffett is a gem. Like you don't really see much of him. And I wish we could. I'm sure there are a lot of leaders that don't get talked about enough because they're
Mm-hmm.
usually in the background. But I
Yeah.
could talk about the bosses that I liked working with and I have so much respect for them. I wish there were more of them.
Mm-hmm. This It is funny, like you said, like as you were talking about Warren Buffett and how maybe he's not spoken about very often, and there probably are many of these quieter leaders who embody values, integrity, morals, good decision making, philanthropy, etc., but aren't as newsworthy. And I'm contrasting that with, the last couple of days, Elon Musk and President Trump's kind of very, very public implosion of their relationship and the insults that they're throwing back and forth at each other and like dirt and whatever. It's a huge contrast. Like that kind of person is very much in the public eye and they're both very wealthy, Musk and Trump, but they aren't behaving in ways that I would want my kids, and I certainly don't want to follow either. Like it's tough when there's a lot out there that shines a light on things that aren't so respectable. And how do trying to remember that this isn't everyone. And I totally get what you said about rich people are jerks and how that's this narrative has been like emphasized in the past couple of weeks with everything that's going on with this idea of like wealthy people and being reckless with their decisions and playing with people's lives. I don't know. It's just wild how like what you were saying, it really resonates and is very topical and of the moment given what's happening. And I don't want to embrace that mentality of rich people are bad and I don't want my kids to, but I also don't want them to think like money is everything, money is what makes you great, money is what makes you have power and influence. I mean, that's not the only thing that should, you know what I mean? Like it's complicated. But yeah, the stories that we start to internalize and the lessons we pick up from the people that are out there and that we see and that our media holds up and puts on a pedestal they're kind of unavoidable. And it's good when we can identify that, oh, this is what I'm starting to glean from this, and it's not necessarily true, and it's not necessarily what I want to embrace or what I want my kids to espouse.
Mm. Funny you bring these up because like I certainly don't pass judgment on what I'm seeing right now. In fact, I'm a happy spectator because we would not have seen this otherwise, and I'm glad that they're being transparent because if there's one thing that I can pick up from recent events is that how much money you make or are capable of making does not it's a very different it's a totally different thing from your character, right? It does not say anything about your character. Like those are two different
Hmm.
things.
Yeah.
I have a
Does
lot
not
of
make you a better person. Yeah.
yeah, I have a lot of respect. So I have even a lot more respect for people who do make the money and who are in positions of power but still choose to do good, and not just
Yes.
for the camera, right? Because you
Mhm.
could tell the difference between someone who's just doing it for the camera or for validation and people who really mean what they say because they make tough decisions and do things that may not necessarily be in their favor, but it's just the right thing to do for the public good.
Yeah.
Now
Yeah.
there's no, I'm not also holding everyone to that moral standard. Like you can do whatever you want with your money, but it's nice when you see someone who cares beyond just themselves, right? So I'm just naturally drawn to that. Doesn't mean that you're less than if you don't meet those standards, but I just personally am drawn to people who think about things more than their self-interests.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think I like you very much appreciate those people that choose to have a broader positive impact beyond their own, maybe their families or their own pocketbooks, right? And there's some people that really lean into that, like Mackenzie Scott, ex-wife of Jeff Bezos, is famous for getting all this money in the divorce and really like leaning into so hard giving, like the radical philanthropy. And I love that because what truly, if you have $1.5 billion, you don't need that to live. You don't need that to live extravagantly. You could, you know what I mean, give so much of that away. And that's really what she has started to do. So there's that. And then there's also this spectrum of like, there's people that maybe are in the middle, and then you have people that are really just show up as very selfish, and that plays out and informs who they are and their decision making, et cetera. Or from what I can tell, I don't know everything. Obviously, we don't have insight into their tax returns, but um, there's this is making me think of a show I just watched. It was a movie called Mountainhead. It's by the guy that Jesse Armstrong, who also did Succession, the series, which all send, Succession, if you haven't watched it, it's
Only the
kind of like, have you watched it? Yeah.
I didn't finish. It was too long, but yeah, I hear like that's very accurate. And coming from a family business background as well. Like, I'm sorry, not to interrupt you, but yes.
No, yeah. Yeah. It's riveting watching, and it's, about loosely, I think, inspired by the Rupert Murdoch family and all of this, but the ways that money and wealth can impact your moral compass. And I think this movie, The Mountainhead, also similarly, it deals with all of these tech founders who are the poorest of them is worth $521 million. And the wealthiest is like 223 billion, just because of their investments and like the companies they founded and what they're valued at. But it's wild to see how out of touch they become with like actual human dilemmas and what they're willing to sacrifice or what they're willing to overlook in a way in their own self-interest and in what they dub to see as what they deem to be most important. So I don't know. You don't have to watch the movie. It was actually, some people might like it. It was one of those movies that I had to grit my teeth, but I wanted to get through because they're not good people. And the the premise is there's this guy that is founded like a social media platform. He releases all of these super well advanced AI tools, and it turns out they allow for the easy production of very believable deep fakes that people can't tell if it's true or not, or they can't tell that it's fake. So then there's you know, Syrians who are being cast in a light of, or warring tribes. They suddenly are looking at videos of their enemies doing awful things to them or their people. And it looks so real that it's like inciting riots and wars and assassinations. And they're like, it's okay. Like this is part of this is just the collateral damage of a tool that is so progressive, and everyone is frustrated with something at first, but then you get through this moment and then they're like, this is the coolest thing ever. It portrayed a very believable arc of character that is unfortunate. And I think, I worry that is that something that people with extreme wealth actually do? Sometimes that's how they show up as. Like, I don't know. I would encourage people to watch it, even if it's just out of curiosity, because it does make you want to be careful about the things and the ways that money can, extreme wealth can influence decision making of the people that, are in that position. So anyway, I kind of went off on a real tangent there, but in speaking about role models, I guess, and how, the people that we look to and the people that are spoken about and talked about, and trying to be really careful to understand, stay informed as to what they're doing and why they might be doing things. And like to your point, money doesn't necessarily mean that person is a good person.
Yeah, I'm not to simplify things into good and bad because it's more complicated than that. But I do get your point. It reminds me, I'm gonna out my mom, but when I was in high school, like you are in this life stage where you're learning a lot, so you're more confident in the way that you speak. And there have been times when I have made my mom feel pretty dumb, and she slapped me in the face because she said that what is the point of you being smart if you don't have the right values, right?
Mm,
And I'm not like sharing this to out my mom, but I in that moment I felt like I deserved it because looking back, those were my critical development stages, right? Like these are the times where I learn what my values are, what good and bad is. And it starts there. If you have the right values, or if you develop the right values at that age, then how do you think that would compound later on in life? What do you actually value? If you value performance and doing whatever it takes at the expense of your relationships, how do you think that's going to compound into an adult later on in life? So yeah, which is why, like, I was listening to our previous episodes and how the time and energy that you put into really teaching your daughters the right values at this young age, it's this time. Because if you lose this time in this relationship at this stage in their lives, what kind of next generation are we
mm,
teaching,
yeah. And, I thank you for sharing that story, by the way. And I kind of love, like, even though in this, gentle parenting, this is phase of how people are raised, it doesn't necessarily fit. But I think that I really respect that checking mechanism of like, hey, and you even said like you probably might have deserved it, or you kind of felt like that. Like there's this element of like there need to be some checks, and someone needs to call people out. And as parents, I think one of the ways we can do that, especially, with the media and how much our kids consume outside of what we see. Like I know that my daughters and all their friends have Snapchat and TikTok, and I'm not, I have no deep insight into everything that they're exposed to. But when it does come up, or when I choose to bring it up, like I can speak to the people that I know are on their radar, and almost like media literacy, where you question, like, what do you think of this? How do we know that to be true? What might make it not so true? And what is this good or bad? And if this is bad, what can we do to try and change this course of action, or try and hold this person accountable? I think that's something I'm trying to lean into more, because it's not always priority, right? When you're just trying to make dinner, or just trying to, pay the bills, or line things up. But as the opportunities arise, I'm trying to be more conscious of like encouraging them to question and not take things at face value. And if they see something that's not functioning in a way that seems totally like on the up and up, or evolving in a respectful and coming from a place of integrity, like, is there something that we can do to help course correct? The thing that's coming to mind right now is all these demonstrations and peaceful protests in the United States about things that are coming up since this administration came into office. And, that's an opportunity to kind of show and exhibit that you are trying to hold people accountable, or even just talking about the fact that people are showing up and debating that and, dissecting that with your kids is important too. Like what are the ways that we can show dissent in a productive and peaceful manner? Because yeah, I think we touched on this in the previous episode, but if we if we don't speak up, our silence is agreement. And so being able to look at the people that either our kids have as role models or society is elevating, and speaking out when things don't quite jive is like, it's almost like positive and negative thinking. Like, how our brains tend towards negativity. So we have to actively feed it positivity, like a pizza oven. We got to like shove in these positive thoughts. I think it's that way too with what we see in the media. Like, it's not enough just to think that our, we are exposed or our kids are going to be exposed to balanced information. We have to identify the things that are meaningful to us to speak out about and kind of offset that intentionally and, with some effort, just to counterbalance these messages about society and people that may not be what we want them to believe. Like, not all rich people are bad and money isn't bad. You know, when they see Elon Musk being making bad choices and being whatever, like, are they starting to internalize that message of like, well, rich people are jerks and I don't want to be rich because I don't want to be a jerk? Like, we need to actively find alternatives like Warren Buffett or, Mackenzie Scott to sort of illustrate to them that money in itself is not the problem. Anyway.
Mhm. I I'm actually conflicted about the speaking out part. I don't necessarily agree that silence means you are complicit because it's just the nature of power, right? Like it's much more complicated than that. Speaking out might and it depends on how you speak out also.
I think that's huge. Yeah.
It might put the other person into defensive mode. What I am curious about is the sense of there seems to be a recurring theme of like our fear of power, right? Because when people use power to advance their self-interests at the expense of other people, then we feel uncomfortable. We come to terms with the reality of how dangerous the world can be, of how there can be bad actors. And so the leaders that I really look up to are people who understand the landscape and know how to strategize around the landscape and still choose to do good, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
that's really someone with high integrity because they can be the people who can win the game and still choose to do good for the public.
Mm. And I think even choosing to shine the light on those people can be an act of quote unquote speaking out. It doesn't necessarily have to be a conflict with the things you don't believe in. It can be focusing and, elevating and admiring the things you do believe in. And because I think that, like, as an example, just as a very like a micro example, but one of my neighbors, he will go out maybe every 2 months and with a trash bag and just pick up trash off the street just to keep the street looking pretty. And it's not just his yard, he does it up and down the whole block on both sides. And that's something that I always try to point out to the girls, and they've done it sometimes too, just to kind of like be part of that beautification movement. But, so admiring and complimenting or, giving positive praise and attention to what you think is working is just as important, if not more important, than like pointing at the person who litters and saying that sucks and you're a terrible person. So to me, taking action maybe is kind of my mentality. Like, it's not a, I can't just look at I can't just watch someone litter or let my daughter see someone litter and not say something. It doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to say something to that person, but they need to know that the behavior I see I don't think is acceptable and here's why. And then they also need to know here's what you can do that is actually kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum and why I think it's good. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. One thing that I actually wanted to point out with what you just shared is like I think the difference between the leaders that I admire at least and the leaders that I don't necessarily want to look up to as role models is this sense of connection. And I've mentioned this
Mm,
book before, The Rethinking Narcissism by Dr. Craig Malkin. There's healthy narcissism and there's, narcissism as in the negative sense.
mm,
Difference with healthy narcissism and those the ones that lean unhealthy are when you look at a leader and you look at them like they're very high up, you put them on a pedestal, you lose that sense of connection, right? Because like you're just worshiping them. But the
mm,
kind of leaders that you have connection with, it's a symbiotic relationship. You're not putting them on a pedestal, you're in fact holding them accountable still. So think of it like I think of this as like I recognize the human behind the office that this leader represents, and I will hold this person who is prone to error to the standards of the office that they hold.
mm. And if I mean, just to help the listeners and me understand a bit, are you speaking specifically to like political office, or are you thinking just generally like,
Just generally. So if I were to, because when you think of a leader or a role model, you tend to attribute like positive characteristics to them, almost like they cannot be at fault, but they can be, right?
mm, mm,
And as people who are giving them the power and the voice because we are admiring them from below here, that's one way I hold the leaders that I look up to accountable, right?
mm, mm,
And I'm not wearing like these goggles of like admiration, but I can see them for who they are and how I want them to be because I respect them for certain qualities or characteristics. And if they don't fit that bill, then then they don't. I can see that too.
mm. I love that. Yeah, I think if there was like if something that you wanted to leave with the audience, I feel like that might be part of it. Or why don't you share kind of what you'd like other people to take away from this episode?
I think exactly that, leaders, you can hold your leaders accountable. Like they don't necessarily have to live up there on a pedestal because there's a difference between the person behind who you admire and the office or the idea that you hold of them.
Hmm. That's a really empowering statement, I think, because like you said, I think maybe sometimes people think folks are untouchable at a certain point. But yes, holding them accountable and remembering they're human, that's really, really impactful.
Thanks for listening to The Coach is In. If something from today's episode made you stop and think or even roll your eyes, don't worry. That's part of the process. If you're curious to hear more, hit follow, leave a review, or share this episode with someone who gets it. Remember, we're not promising perfect answers, but every small shift can make a big difference. Until next time, take care of yourself. The coach is in, and this space is for you.